A school principal was mocked and ridiculed for opening his home to 5 orphaned black sisters. But what happens years later when those same mockers are struck by disaster and find themselves at the mercy of the very programs he established? Who are these girls whose lives were transformed by a simple act of kindness, and how do they become key to the survival of a whole community? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty hallway as James made his evening rounds through Lincoln Elementary. His footsteps echoed against the worn linoleum floors, a familiar sound after 15 years as principal. As he passed room 204, movement caught his eye. The same 5 sisters were there again, hunched over their desks, completely absorbed in their work. Lisa, the oldest at 17, was helping little Ellie with her math homework. Mary sat nearby, her nose buried in a thick science textbook. In the corner, Janet and Bethany worked quietly on what looked like an art project, their hands covered in paint. James paused in the doorway, his heart heavy. For the past 2 weeks, he'd noticed them staying well past the after-school program's end time at 5 p.m. It was nearly 6:30 now. "Good evening, girls," he said softly, not wanting to startle them. 5 heads snapped up, eyes wide with worry. Lisa quickly stood, positioning herself slightly in front of her sisters. "We're sorry, Mr. Thompson. We'll leave right away." "No rush," James said, keeping his voice gentle. He pulled a package of cookies from his briefcase. He'd started carrying snacks just for moments like this. "I thought you might be hungry. Would you like some?" The younger girl's eyes lit up, but they looked to Lisa for permission. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. James placed the cookies on an empty desk and stepped back, giving them space. Over the next few days, James made similar stops, bringing different snacks each time: granola bars, fruit cups, juice boxes. He'd sit quietly at the teacher's desk, doing his own paperwork while the girls worked. Gradually, their tense shoulders relaxed. They stopped jumping every time he moved. One evening, as Ellie happily munched on apple slices, she spoke up. "The lights are always on here, and it's warm." James noticed how the other sisters quickly looked at their books, avoiding eye contact. Mary's knuckles went white around her pencil. "Yes, it is warm," James agreed carefully. "Do you like spending time here after school?" Janet, usually the quietest, whispered, "We can see our homework better here. The shelter's lights aren't very good." Lisa shot her sister a warning look, but the words were already out. James kept his expression neutral, though his heart clenched. He'd had suspicions, but hearing it confirmed was different. "The library has good lights too," he said casually, "and computers if you need them for assignments." "We like it here better," Mary said firmly. "Ms. Rodriguez lets us use the art supplies, and nobody bothers us." James nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The classroom was their safe haven, a place where they could just be normal kids doing homework. Each day, James watched them pack up their belongings with increasing reluctance. Their movements grew slower, more hesitant, as if trying to stretch each minute. When they finally headed toward the exit, their shoulders would hunch, faces tightening with worry. Tonight was no different. From his office window, James watched the 5 sisters step out into the growing darkness. Lisa held Ellie's hand, while Mary walked behind their younger sisters like a guard. They paused at the school gates, and even from a distance, James could see their reluctance to leave their sanctuary. The next morning, James arranged his desk carefully, placing a bowl of fresh fruit and some granola bars where the sisters could easily reach them. He'd asked Ms. Rodriguez to send them to his office during their usual after-school time, wanting to make the meeting feel as natural as possible. At 4:30, a gentle knock echoed through his office. "Come in," he called, standing to greet them. The sisters filed in quietly, Lisa leading the way with Ellie clutching her hand. They settled into the chairs he'd arranged, their eyes darting around the warm office space. "You're not in trouble," James said immediately, noting their nervous expressions. "I just wanted to talk about your wonderful projects. Ms. Rodriguez tells me you're all doing exceptional work." The tension in their shoulders eased slightly. Mary reached for an apple, then hesitated. James nodded encouragingly, and she took it, passing pieces to her younger sisters. "I notice you girls spend a lot of time here after school," James began carefully. "The art project you're working on must be very special." Janet and Bethany exchanged glances. "We like it here," Bethany said softly, studying her hands. "Could you tell me why?" James kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "I want to make sure we're providing everything you need." Lisa's protective mask cracked slightly. She looked at her sisters, then back at James. It's better than going home," she whispered. "Could you help me understand why?" James leaned forward, his heart already aching with what he suspected was coming. Tears welled in Mary's eyes. "Mrs. Peterson, her voice trembled. "She locks the pantry at night, says we eat too much, and if we make noise doing homework after 8. She gets real mad," Ellie finished, her small voice quavering. Lisa wrapped an arm around her youngest sister. "Our parents died 2 years ago, car accident. Mrs. Peterson, she took us all in, but she doesn't really want us. She just wants the checks." James felt his throat tighten as the stories spilled out. Cold rooms, locked cabinets, harsh punishments for minor infractions. The sisters spoke in quiet voices, each revelation more heartbreaking than the last. "The shelter was better," Janet said, wiping her eyes. "But they couldn't keep us all together. Mrs. Peterson was the only one who'd take all 5 of us. So we try to stay here as long as we can," Lisa explained. "It's warm and quiet, and nobody yells at us for using too much electricity." James sat back in his chair, his mind racing with the weight of their confession. He watched as the sisters huddled together, drawing strength from each other, their young faces carrying burdens no child should bear. As the girls gathered their things to leave, James felt a deep ache in his chest. He'd suspected problems, but the reality was far worse than he'd imagined. They paused at his door, 5 pairs of eyes looking back at him with a mixture of trust and fear that their confession would somehow make things worse. After they left, James sat at his desk running his hands over his face. The sisters' words echoed in his mind, each detail adding to the heavy weight in his heart. He reached for his phone, knowing he needed to talk this through with Sarah. His wife had always been his moral compass, and right now he needed her perspective more than ever. Back at his home that evening, James pushed his dinner around the plate, his usual appetite absent after the day's revelations. Angela noticed his distraction immediately. After 30 years of marriage, she could read his moods like a familiar book. "What's troubling you?" she asked, reaching across their kitchen table to touch his hand. James set his fork down and took a deep breath. "Remember those 5 sisters I mentioned? The ones who always stay late at school?" When Angela nodded, he continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "They came to my office today. Their situation, it's worse than I imagined." He recounted their conversation, watching Angela's eyes fill with tears as he described the locked pantry, the cold rooms, the foster mother's cruel restrictions. "They're staying at school as long as possible just to avoid going home," he finished, his voice cracking. Angela squeezed his hand tighter. "Those poor girls," she whispered. "There must be something we can do." "I've been thinking," James said slowly. "Our house feels so empty since Emily left for college. We have the space, the resources." He met his wife's gaze. "What if we could offer them a home?" Angela's eyes widened. "All 5 of them?" She paused, considering. "That would be a huge change, James." "I know," he admitted. "But remember how we always talked about having more children? Before the complications with Emily's birth?" They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Angela stood and began clearing the dishes, her movements deliberate as she processed the idea. "Emily's room is just collecting dust," she mused. "And we never did anything with the guest rooms after my parents moved to Florida." James joined her at the sink, automatically taking up his usual position as dish dryer. "We'd need to make adjustments, big ones, but Angela, when I saw their faces today, they just need someone to care." "We're not exactly young anymore," Angela said, but her tone was contemplative rather than dismissive. Taking on 5 children at our age. We're not that old, James chuckled softly, and you're still the most nurturing person I know. Your background in social work, you'd understand their needs better than most. Angela passed him another plate, her movements slowing as she considered. The quiet has been getting to me lately, she admitted. Every time I walk past Emily's room, or see the empty chairs at the table. I know, James nodded. Me too. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Angela spoke again. We should sleep on it. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Of course, James agreed, hanging up the dish towel. But? Angela's eyes met his, and he saw the same pull he felt reflected in them. But I keep thinking about those empty rooms upstairs, and about 5 little girls who need a real home. They finished cleaning the kitchen, both feeling the weight and possibility of the decision before them. As they turned off the lights, Angela leaned against James's shoulder. Let's pray about it tonight, she suggested. See how we feel in the morning. James nodded, wrapping an arm around his wife as they headed upstairs, both knowing in their hearts that their quiet, empty nest life was likely about to change dramatically. The next morning, James and Angela sat at their usual breakfast spots. Neither had slept much, their minds filled with thoughts of the 5 sisters and the life-changing decision before them. I couldn't stop thinking about them all night, Angela said, stirring her coffee. Every time I tried to find reasons why we shouldn't do this, my heart just kept saying yes. James reached across the table and took her hand. I feel the same way. It won't be easy, but these girls need us. Then we're really doing this? Angela's eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and tears. We're really doing this, James confirmed, already pulling out his phone. I'm going to call Bill Thompson. He's handled adoptions before, and will need his guidance to navigate this properly. Within an hour, they were sitting in Bill Thompson's office, surrounded by leather-bound law books and the smell of coffee. The lawyer adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed their situation. It's complicated but not impossible, Mr. Thompson explained, pulling out several forms. The fact that James is already connected to the children through the school system could work in our favor. We'll need to document the current living conditions and file for emergency placement. James leaned forward. How quickly can we move on this? I'll contact Ms. Carter at Social Services today. She's good at expediting cases when there's clear need. Mr. Thompson began organizing paperwork into neat piles. You'll need background checks, home studies, character references. Angela pulled out a notebook, already making lists. We can start gathering those immediately. Our house has plenty of space, but we'll need to make some adjustments. Focus on the essentials first, Mr. Thompson advised. Basic safety requirements, separate beds, adequate storage space. Ms. Carter will provide a complete checklist. They spent the next few hours going through forms and requirements. James made several calls to colleagues who could provide character references, while Angela started sketching out room arrangements. By early afternoon, they had a preliminary meeting scheduled with Ms. Carter from Social Services for the following day. The reality of their decision was starting to sink in as they drove home. We should start with Emily's old room, Angela said, already planning. The girls could share rooms in pairs, and we can convert the study for the 5th bed. James nodded, his mind racing with practical considerations. We'll need to get bunk beds, dressers, desks for homework. They spent the rest of the day moving furniture and making lists. Angela cleared out closets while James measured spaces for new beds. Every so often they would stop and look at each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the changes they were initiating. I keep thinking about dinner times, Angela said as she sorted through old clothes to donate. Our quiet meals for 2 are about to become quite lively. James smiled, imagining their empty dining room filled with conversation and life again. We'll need a bigger table, he noted, adding it to their growing list of necessities. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity as they prepared their home for its new inhabitants. Each empty room now held the promise of new beginnings, not just for the 5 sisters, but for James and Angela as well. The front door creaked open as James and Angela stood back, watching the 5 sisters step into their new home. Lisa, the oldest at 17, held little Ellie's hand tightly as they crossed the threshold. Mary, Janet, and Bethany huddled close behind them, their backpacks clutched to their chests like shields. "Welcome home, girls," Angela said softly, her voice warm and gentle. The sisters' eyes darted around the entryway, taking in the family photos on the walls and the soft beige carpet under their feet. "Would you like to see your rooms?" Angela asked, noticing how they seemed unsure where to stand or what to do. 5 pairs of eyes widened at the word rooms, and a tiny smile flickered across Janet's face. Angela led them upstairs, James following at a distance to give them space. She opened the first door to reveal a room painted in soft green with astronomy posters on the walls. "Lisa, Mary, this is your room. We heard you both love science." Lisa's mouth fell open as she spotted the telescope by the window. Mary moved closer to examine the star chart hanging above one of the beds. The next room, decorated in warm yellows with artwork supplies on the desks, was for Janet and Bethany. Colorful pencils and fresh sketchbooks waited on each desk. Bethany's fingers twitched at her sides as she stared at the art supplies. Finally, they reached Ellie's room, the smallest but coziest, with stuffed animals arranged on her bed and fairy lights strung across the ceiling. The 7-year-old's eyes lit up at the sight. "Dinner's almost ready," Angela announced after giving them time to explore. "Would you like to wash up and join us downstairs?" In the dining room, steam rose from bowls of spaghetti and meatballs. The sisters sat close together on one side of the table, while James and Angela took seats opposite them. "We want you to feel comfortable here," James said, passing the garlic bread. "Is there anything special you'd like in your rooms? Or any foods you particularly enjoy?" At first, only quiet murmurs of "thank you" filled the air as plates were passed around. But then Ellie spoke up, her voice tiny but clear. "Could I maybe have a nightlight?" "Of course, sweetheart," Angela replied immediately. This seemed to break something loose in the others. "I like doing homework on the floor sometimes," Janet ventured. "Would that be okay?" "Absolutely," James nodded. "These are your rooms now. You can study wherever you feel comfortable." After dinner, Angela brought out board games. They started with Uno, its simple rules helping to ease the tension. Mary turned out to be competitive, grinning triumphantly when she won the first round. Bethany, usually the quietest, giggled when James drew 4 cards. As the evening progressed, the rigid postures of the sisters began to relax. Lisa helped Ellie hold her cards, whispering strategy advice that made the little girl beam. Janet and Bethany shared knowing looks when Mary celebrated another win. The atmosphere shifted from cautious politeness to something warmer. When Ellie yawned widely, causing a chain reaction among her sisters, soft laughter rippled around the table. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was real, a gentle sound of relief and budding comfort in their new home. The next day at school, James paused outside the teacher's lounge, his hand frozen on the doorknob as familiar voices drifted through the partially open door. "I just don't understand what he was thinking," Mrs. Peterson's voice carried clearly. 5 children at once? It seems rather impulsive for a school principal." "And what about his objectivity?" Mr. Harrison added. "How can he make unbiased decisions when his own children are involved?" James's chest tightened, but he straightened his shoulders and pushed the door open. The conversation died immediately, replaced by awkward shuffling and forced smiles. Later that week, during the monthly PTA meeting, the tension in the room was palpable. James maintained his professional demeanor as he went through the usual agenda items, but he could feel the scrutiny in every pair of eyes. "I'd like to address the elephant in the room." Mrs. Thompson, a particularly vocal parent, stood up during the open discussion. "Many of us are concerned about the recent adoption of 5 students by our principal. Doesn't this create a conflict of interest?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. James gripped the podium, his knuckles white but his voice steady. "I appreciate your concern. However, I can assure you that my personal life will not affect my ability to serve this school community fairly and effectively." "But what about discipline issues?" another parent chimed in. How can we trust you'll be impartial?" Before James could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez, a veteran teacher, stood up. "I've worked with Mr. James for 8 years. His integrity has never wavered, and I don't expect it to start now. If anything, this shows his dedication to our students' well-being." After the meeting, a small group gathered around James. Mr. Chen, whose daughter was in Janet's class, clasped his hand warmly. "What you did takes courage. Those girls needed a home and you opened yours. That's what really matters." Ms. Wilson, the school counselor, added her support. "I've seen how those girls have changed already. They're more confident, more engaged. You've given them hope." In his office later that afternoon, James sat at his desk, looking at the family photo he'd just added, all 7 of them at the park last weekend. The sisters' smiles, still tentative but genuine, reminded him why he'd made this decision. A knock at his door revealed Mrs. Martinez, a parent who'd been quiet during the meeting. "I just wanted you to know," she said softly. "My husband and I were foster children. What you did, it matters more than these people understand." As James walked home that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The day's events played through his mind, the whispers, the accusations, but also the warm handshakes and encouraging words. He thought of Lisa helping Ellie with her homework at their kitchen table, of Mary's proud grin when she made the honor roll, of Janet and Bethany finally feeling safe enough to join after-school clubs. His steps grew more confident with each block. The critics could whisper all they wanted. He knew in his heart he'd made the right choice. The weekend brought a gentle autumn breeze through the open windows of the family's home. Angela stood at the kitchen counter, showing Mary and Lisa how to knead bread dough, while Bethany carefully measured ingredients for cookies. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of rising bread and occasional bursts of laughter. In the backyard, James worked with Janet and Ellie, teaching them how to plant fall flowers. Their hands dug into the soft earth together, as James explained which plants needed more sunlight and which preferred shade. "Like this?" Ellie asked, carefully placing a chrysanthemum in the hole she'd dug. "Perfect," James smiled, helping her pat the soil around the roots. "You've got a natural green thumb." The following week brought new challenges as the family settled into their routines. Mornings became a carefully orchestrated dance of bathroom schedules and breakfast preparations. Angela created a chart that hung in the hallway, helping everyone keep track of their responsibilities. At school, the sisters faced varying reactions from their classmates. Lisa, the oldest, overheard whispers in the hallway between classes. "I heard they're only here because Mr. James felt sorry for them," one girl said to another. But others, like Sarah Martinez, made a point of sitting with Janet at lunch. "My mom says your dad is really brave," she told Janet, sharing her cookies. "Want to come to my birthday party next weekend?" After school, James set up a homework station in the dining room. Each sister had their own space, and he moved between them, helping with math problems or reviewing English essays. The arrangement drew curious looks from teachers passing by his office, but Ms. Wilson, the school counselor, noticed the improvement in the girls' grades. "They're thriving," she told James during a staff meeting. "Especially Bethany. Her participation in class has increased significantly." Saturday morning found the family at the local park. Angela packed a picnic lunch while James organized a friendly game of basketball. Mary, typically quiet, surprised everyone with her natural athletic ability, making shot after shot while her sisters cheered. Other families at the park watched the unusual group, some with obvious curiosity, others with warm smiles. When Ellie fell and scraped her knee, all 4 sisters rushed to help, with Angela close behind with the first aid kit she'd thoughtfully packed. "You're okay," Lisa soothed, holding her youngest sister's hand while Angela cleaned the scrape. James watched proudly as his new daughters demonstrated the bond that was growing stronger each day. During lunch, spread out on checkered blankets under a maple tree, Mary spoke up. "Tommy in my class asked if it was weird having the principal as my dad," she said, picking at her sandwich crust. "What did you tell him?" Angela asked gently. "I said it's not weird. It's nice having someone who cares," Mary replied, meeting James's eyes with a small smile. As the afternoon sun blazed above their heads, they packed up their picnic. Each sister helped carry something to the car, working together without being asked. The park outing had strengthened their sense of unity, showing them that they could face public scrutiny as a family. 2 years had passed and transformed their routines into a well-orchestrated symphony. Lisa stood at the counter, gulping down coffee while reviewing her biology notes. Her white lab coat hung pressed and ready by the door. "Don't forget your lunch," Angela called out, sliding a packed container across the counter. Mary adjusted her police cadet uniform in the hallway mirror, double-checking her appearance before heading to the academy. Her confidence had grown steadily since starting the program, and her instructors often praised her natural leadership abilities. In the living room, Janet and Bethany huddled over their science fair project, a detailed model of the solar system that had already won them recognition at the district level. Ellie, the youngest, practiced her lines for the school play, her voice carrying through the house with newfound assurance. Later that morning, Lisa sat in her advanced biology lecture, her hand shooting up to answer questions about cellular structures. Her professor nodded approvingly as she explained complex concepts with clarity. During lab work, her partners sought her help, impressed by her steady hands and thorough understanding. Across town at the police academy, Mary navigated a tactical training exercise. She moved with precision through the simulation, making split-second decisions that earned her top marks. Her instructor pulled her aside afterward. "Your situational awareness is exceptional," he noted. "Just like last week's hostage negotiation scenario." At the middle school, Janet and Bethany presented their science project to enthusiastic applause. Their detailed research and confident presentation reflected hours of preparation with James, who had helped them practice in the garage. Meanwhile, Ellie's drama teacher beamed as she delivered her monologue without missing a beat, her previous shyness replaced by theatrical flair. That evening, the family gathered around the dining room table, now adorned with birthday decorations for Lisa's celebration. Textbooks and police manuals were temporarily set aside as they shared a special meal Angela had prepared. The walls around them displayed photos marking their journey, science fair ribbons, drama club performances, and Mary's first day at the academy. James watched his daughters pass dishes around the table, their easy laughter and comfortable banter a testament to how far they'd come. Lisa opened her gifts, including a new stethoscope from her parents and handmade cards from her sisters. "Remember when you used to practice taking our blood pressure every night?" Mary teased, causing Lisa to blush. "Well, it paid off. I got the highest grade in clinical skills last week," Lisa replied proudly. Angela squeezed James's hand under the table as they watched their daughters interact. The scared, hesitant girls who had first entered their home had blossomed into confident young women, each pursuing her own dreams with determination and support from their family. "I'm so proud of all of you," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he raised his glass in a toast to Lisa and her sister's achievements. The school hallways buzzed with worried whispers as James rushed toward the nurse's office. The urgent call about Mr. Thompson had interrupted his morning meeting, and his heart raced as he approached the door. Inside, he found the school nurse looking grave. "Mr. Thompson collapsed during his third period class," she explained. "The hospital just called. He needs an immediate blood transfusion, but his blood type is extremely rare. They're struggling to find a match." James felt a complex mix of emotions. Mr. Thompson had been one of his harshest critics when he'd adopted the girls, often making pointed remarks during staff meetings. Yet now the man's life hung in the balance. The nurse continued, "The hospital is asking if we can help spread the word. They need donors with AB negative blood." James's eyes widened. Just last month, during Ellie's routine physical, they'd discovered she had that exact blood type. The doctor had mentioned how uncommon it was. At home that evening, James and Angela sat with Ellie in the living room. The youngest sister listened intently as they explained Mr. Thompson's situation and her unique position to help. "But she's only 14, Angela said softly, concern evident in her voice. "Is it even safe?" James nodded. "I spoke with the hospital. They said she meets the age and weight requirements, but it's completely her choice." Ellie sat quietly for a moment, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Mr. Thompson, he's the one who said those mean things about our family, right?" "Yes, sweetie," Angela replied, "but that doesn't have to affect your decision." "I remember when he got sick during class," Ellie said. "He looked really scared." She paused, then looked up at her parents with determination. "I want to help him." James and Angela exchanged proud glances. Their youngest daughter, who had once been too frightened to speak up in class, was now volunteering to help someone who had once opposed their family. The next morning, the family walked through the hospital's sliding doors together. Ellie's steps were steady, though she gripped Angela's hand tightly. The donation center's bright lights and sterile smell made everything feel more intense. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" James asked one final time. Ellie nodded, her chin held high. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "That's what you taught us." The donation center's door stood open, waiting. Ellie took a deep breath and walked forward, her family's loving support giving her the courage to help save a life, even if it belonged to someone who had once doubted the strength of their family bonds. In the days following her blood donation, Ellie rested at home, surrounded by get-well cards from her classmates. The story of her selfless act had spread quickly through the school halls, turning whispers of criticism into murmurs of admiration. "Look at all these cards," Angela said, arranging another bouquet of flowers on Ellie's bedside table. "Your classmates really care about you." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mr. Thompson's condition showed remarkable improvement. The transfusion had worked exactly as the doctors had hoped, and his color returned to normal. During his recovery, he spent long hours reflecting on his previous judgments about James and his family. When James visited Mr. Thompson's hospital room, the atmosphere was markedly different from their past interactions. "James," Mr. Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you and your daughter enough." Back at school, the change in attitude was palpable. Teachers who had once been distant now stopped by James's office to express their admiration. Mrs. Parker, the English teacher, wiped tears from her eyes as she told James, "What Ellie did? It shows exactly the kind of values you and Angela have instilled in those girls." During a staff meeting, several teachers proposed organizing a special assembly to acknowledge Ellie's bravery. The suggestion received unanimous support, even from those who had previously been skeptical of James's decision to adopt the sisters. When the day of the assembly arrived, the school gymnasium buzzed with excitement. Mr. Thompson, now recovered enough to attend, stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Ellie sat in the front row between James and Angela, her cheeks pink with shy embarrassment. "2 weeks ago," Mr. Thompson began, his voice carrying across the silent gymnasium, "I learned a profound lesson about judgment and compassion. When I needed help, it came from someone I had wrongly criticized." He paused, looking directly at Ellie. "This young lady's selfless act didn't just save my life. It opened my eyes to the true meaning of family and community." The gymnasium remained silent as Mr. Thompson continued, "I owe an apology to Principal Matthews and his family. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I missed seeing the beautiful example of love and courage right in front of me." His voice cracked slightly. Ellie's decision to help someone who had shown her family unkindness demonstrates a maturity and compassion that many adults, myself included, could learn from. Students and teachers alike dabbed at their eyes as Mr. Thompson stepped down from the podium and walked over to where Ellie sat. He extended his hand to her, and when she stood up, he surprised everyone by giving her a gentle hug. The gymnasium erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the walls as the entire school community rose to their feet. James watched as his youngest daughter, once so timid and uncertain, stood tall in front of her peers, a quiet smile on her face. Around him, the same teachers who had once questioned his judgment now beamed with pride and appreciation. The atmosphere in the school had shifted fundamentally, and he could feel the warmth of acceptance and understanding replacing the previous undercurrent of doubt and criticism. The story of Ellie's selfless act spread beyond the school walls, touching hearts throughout the community. Local newspapers ran features about the young girl who saved her teacher's life, and people began stopping James and his family in the grocery store to express their admiration. "Your daughter's kindness is exactly what this town needs more of," Mrs. Henderson, the elderly owner of the local bakery, told James one morning as she handed him an extra Danish. "And the way you've raised those girls, it's just wonderful." Similar encounters happened almost daily. At church, at restaurants, even at the gas station, community members approached the family to share their appreciation. The narrative had shifted dramatically from whispered doubts about adopting 5 sisters to widespread respect for the values James and Angela had instilled in their daughters. Mayor Johnson noticed the changing tide of public opinion. One afternoon, he invited James to lunch at the local diner. The mayor, a seasoned politician with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile, got straight to the point. "James, we need people like you on the city council," Mayor Johnson said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Someone who understands family values and has proven their commitment to the community. The election's coming up in 6 months, and I think you should run." James nearly choked on his sandwich. "Me? On the city council?" "Think about it," the mayor continued. "You could help implement programs for foster children, improve our education system, make real changes. Your story resonates with people." That evening, James shared the unexpected proposal with his family over dinner. Angela listened intently while serving extra helpings of mashed potatoes. "What would it mean for your time at school?" Angela asked, her forehead creasing with concern. "I'd still be principal," James explained. "The council meets twice a month in the evenings, but it would mean more responsibilities, more public appearances." Lisa, their eldest, spoke up from across the table. "Dad, you could help other kids like us. Maybe make the foster system better." Mary nodded enthusiastically. "And you already know so much about what the schools need." The younger girls chimed in with their support, though Janet, always the practical one, asked, "But won't it be really hard work?" James looked around at his family, at Angela's supportive smile, at the eager faces of their daughters. He thought about other children in situations similar to what his girls had faced, about the changes he could help implement. After several days of careful consideration and family discussions, James invited Mayor Johnson to his office. With steady conviction in his voice, he said, "I'll do it. I'll run for city council." The mayor beamed, reaching across the desk to shake James's hand. "You're making the right choice, James. This town needs someone like you." Later that afternoon, James stood before a small gathering of reporters on the school steps, Angela and their daughters beside him. With clear purpose in his voice, he announced his candidacy for city council, emphasizing his commitment to education, family services, and community development. The small crowd that had gathered, mostly parents and teachers who had heard about the announcement, broke into supportive applause. Among them, Mr. Thompson stood quietly smiling, his presence a testament to the transformative power of compassion and understanding. James's campaign headquarters buzzed with activity as volunteers made phone calls and organized campaign materials. The converted storefront downtown had become a second home for the family, with homework sessions happening between campaign meetings and dinner often served on folding tables. "Remember, Dad, you've got the PTA meeting at 4 and the town hall at 7, Lisa reminded him, checking the schedule board they'd mounted on the wall. James nodded, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the window. Campaign life had brought new challenges to their already busy household. Between his duties as principal and his campaign commitments, every minute counted. At the town hall meeting that evening, James stood at the podium, his family seated in the front row. "Our community needs leadership that understands the challenges facing our families," he said, his voice steady and passionate. "As a school principal and father of 6 daughters, I've seen firsthand how the right support can transform lives." The opposition didn't wait long to strike. Headlines appeared questioning James's judgment in adopting 5 sisters while serving as their school principal. Anonymous letters to the editor suggested he'd used his position inappropriately. "Look at this," Angela said one morning, showing James the latest attack ad in the local paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the newspaper. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We knew this might happen. The truth will speak for itself." The sisters rallied around their father. Mary and Lisa organized a youth voter registration drive at the high school. Janet, Bethany, and Ellie handed out campaign flyers at the grocery store, their bright smiles winning over skeptical shoppers. During one particularly heated debate, James's opponent, Councilman Roberts, tried to paint him as inexperienced. "Running a school is not the same as running a city," Roberts declared smugly. James remained calm. "You're right, it's not the same. But every day, I work with families, manage budgets, and make decisions that affect hundreds of lives. I understand our community because I serve it every day, not just during election season." The audience erupted in applause. As election day approached, the campaign intensified. James's team worked tirelessly, coordinating volunteers and organizing last-minute rallies. The sisters took turns manning the phone banks after school, while Angela managed the campaign's social media presence. Finally, election night arrived. The family gathered at campaign headquarters with supporters, watching as results trickled in. Angela held James's hand tightly as they stared at the television screen. The sisters huddled together on a worn couch, barely breathing as the numbers updated. The room fell silent when the final precinct reported. Then the news anchor's voice rang out. "With all precincts reporting, we can now declare James Wilson the winner of the city council election." The headquarters erupted in cheers. Supporters hugged and cried. The sisters rushed to embrace their father, creating a group hug that nearly knocked him over. Angela wiped tears from her eyes as she joined them. James looked around at his family and supporters, overwhelmed by the moment. His campaign message of community, family, and positive change had resonated with voters, earning him a seat on the city council. The city council chamber hummed with tension as James stood at the podium, his voice clear and determined. "We can't ignore the fact that families in our community are struggling," he said, gesturing to the charts displayed behind him. 20% of our children live below the poverty line, and our after-school programs are severely underfunded." Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but James pressed on. "I'm proposing a comprehensive initiative that will address both housing accessibility and educational support. By partnering with local developers, we can create affordable housing units while establishing learning centers within these communities." Councilwoman Martinez leaned forward. "The budget implications will be offset by private sector partnerships," James interjected smoothly. "I've already spoken with several local businesses willing to contribute to the job training programs." Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into bringing his vision to life. He met with Sarah Chen from the Community Development Corporation, walking through empty warehouses that could be converted into training centers. "We can set up computer labs here," he explained, his footsteps echoing in the vacant space. "And classrooms for GED preparation over there." The initiative gained momentum as more community leaders joined the effort. Pastor Williams offered his church basement for evening classes, while the local carpenters' union agreed to provide apprenticeship opportunities. James coordinated these efforts from his office, often working late into the evening. During a visit to the first completed learning center, James watched as adults worked on resume writing while their children received homework help in the next room. A woman approached him, her eyes bright with tears. "My daughter's grades have improved so much since starting the tutoring program," she said. "And I'm finally learning the computer skills I need for a better job." At the monthly progress meeting, James presented the initial results to the city council. "In just 3 months, we've helped 30 families secure stable housing, and our job training programs have already placed 15 people in full-time positions," he reported. The numbers spoke for themselves, and even his former critics nodded approvingly. Walking through one of the new housing developments, James stopped to chat with residents tending a community garden, another component of the initiative. Children played safely in a newly constructed playground while parents gathered on benches nearby, discussing their recent job interviews and sharing resources. The transformation wasn't just in the physical spaces. James saw it in the proud smiles of parents who'd found employment, in the improved test scores of students receiving tutoring, and in the growing sense of community among residents who'd previously felt isolated and forgotten. As he sat in his office reviewing the latest program statistics, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The charts and graphs before him told a story of real change: families moving toward stability, children performing better in school, and a community growing stronger together. This was exactly why he'd run for office, and seeing these positive changes made all the long hours and hard work worthwhile. Back at home, the aroma of Angela's lasagna filled the dining room as the family gathered around the table. James looked at the faces of his daughters with pride, remembering how far they'd come from those first hesitant days at school. "Tell us more about your first week of residency," Angela encouraged Lisa, passing the garlic bread. Lisa's eyes lit up. "It's been incredible. Yesterday, I helped treat a young girl who reminded me so much of Ellie at that age." She glanced at her youngest sister with a warm smile. "The hospital serves many underprivileged families, and I feel like I can really make a difference there." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've always had such a big heart." Mary reached for the salad bowl, her strong arms showing the results of her police academy training. "Speaking of making a difference, we had an amazing community outreach session today. Instead of just learning tactical moves, we focused on building trust with local residents." "That's exactly what good policing needs," James nodded approvingly. "How are the physical requirements treating you?" "Top of my class in the obstacle course," Mary grinned. "All those years of basketball with you really paid off, Dad." Janet, now a high school junior, couldn't contain her excitement any longer. "I got an A+ on my science project. Mr. Thompson said it was the best presentation he's seen in years." "The same Mr. Thompson who—" Angela started. "Yes," Ellie chimed in, touching the small scar on her arm from the blood donation years ago. "He's been super supportive of all of us since then." Bethany, usually the quietest of the sisters, spoke up. "I made the debate team," she announced softly. "We're discussing community development policies next month. Dad, I might need your help preparing." "Of course," James beamed. "You know, watching all of you grow and pursue your dreams, it's more than we could have ever hoped for." Angela reached for her husband's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "Remember when we were worried about having enough love to go around?" she asked, her eyes moving from one daughter to another. "Mom," Ellie protested playfully, "you're getting emotional again." "I think we all are," Lisa admitted, wiping a tear from her eye. "It's just, looking around this table, seeing everyone thriving, it's pretty special." "Speaking of special," Angela said, "I've been thinking about our summer plans. With Lisa's residency schedule and Mary's academy graduation coming up, we should plan something while we can all be together." The sisters immediately burst into excited chatter, suggesting destinations and activities. Their voices overlapped as they discussed beaches, mountains, and city tours. James sat back, taking in the scene before him. The scared, withdrawn girls who once lingered in his school hallways had blossomed into confident, ambitious young women. Each had found her own path while maintaining the tight bond they shared as sisters. "What do you think, Dad?" Mary asked, pulling him back to the vacation discussion. "I think," he said, looking at his family with deep affection, "that anywhere we're together will be perfect." The shrill ring of James's phone cut through the peaceful family dinner. His face grew serious as he listened to the urgent voice on the other end. "I'll be right there," he said, already standing up. "There's a major fire at Lincoln Elementary," he explained quickly to his family. "Several homes in the neighborhood are affected too." James rushed to his car, his mind racing with emergency protocols. As he approached the scene, thick black smoke billowed against the evening sky. Fire trucks lined the streets, their red lights painting everything in an eerie glow. Chief Martinez spotted him and waved him over. "Principal Thompson, we've evacuated the after-school program students and staff, but the fire's spreading to the residential area." James immediately took charge, pulling out his phone to access the school's emergency contact list. "We need to set up a command center at the community center," he directed. "It's 3 blocks away and has capacity for temporary shelter." The firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the blaze while James coordinated with emergency response teams. He watched in horror as flames consumed the east wing of the school, where just that morning children had been learning and playing. "Mr. Thompson!" a familiar voice called out. Mrs. Chen, one of the affected residents, approached with her 2 children. "Our apartment. Everything's gone." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're setting up shelter at the community center. You'll have a safe place to stay tonight." He turned to his assistant who had just arrived. "Sarah, can you escort the Chens to the center? Make sure they're registered for emergency assistance." As the night wore on, more displaced families arrived. James worked with local emergency services to coordinate meals, blankets, and basic supplies. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from community members offering help. Local businesses began sending food and water. Churches opened their doors as additional shelter spaces. James's own daughters called to say they were organizing a clothing drive. Standing in what remained of the school's main hallway, James surveyed the destruction. Water from the fire hoses had soaked everything, and the acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. Cherished student artwork that once decorated the walls now lay in soggy heaps on the floor. A firefighter approached with the preliminary report. "The fire started in the electrical room," he explained. "Spread faster than we expected due to the old wiring. You're lucky no one was hurt." James nodded solemnly, his shoes squelching on the wet floor as he walked through the damaged corridors. The library, where he'd spent countless hours reading to students, was now a blackened shell. The computer lab, recently upgraded through a community fundraising effort, was completely destroyed. Outside, emergency lights continued to flash as crews worked to secure the building. James stood in the parking lot, watching as more community members arrived with donations and offers to help. Despite the devastation before him, the sight of people coming together gave him strength. "We'll rebuild," he said firmly to the gathering of teachers and staff who had come to see the damage. "This building may be damaged, but our community spirit isn't." The community hall buzzed with activity as James directed volunteers in setting up tables and organizing supplies. Emergency cots lined one wall, while the other side held boxes of donated clothes, food, and essential items. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn as more community members called to offer help. "Mr. Thompson," a hesitant voice caught his attention. It was Mr. Peterson, one of the parents who had been most vocal against James's adoption of the sisters. His clothes were smoke-stained, and his eyes were red from exhaustion. "Our apartment. We lost everything." James immediately stepped forward, gesturing to a volunteer. "Let's get you registered for emergency assistance." His voice was kind, showing no trace of their past conflicts. "We have some fresh clothes and hot meals ready." Throughout the morning, more familiar faces appeared. People who had once whispered about him in school hallways, or questioned his decisions at PTA meetings. Now they came seeking help, their previous judgments forgotten in the face of crisis. Mrs. Wallace, another former critic, approached with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong about you," she admitted, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "The way you've organized all this. Thank you." In the afternoon, James gathered everyone for a community meeting. The hall was packed as he stood before them, clipboard in hand. "We need to discuss both immediate needs and long-term recovery," he began. "Every voice matters in this planning process." People who had lost homes shared their concerns about housing and insurance. Parents worried about where their children would attend school while repairs were made. James listened carefully, taking notes and offering practical solutions where possible. "We can use the west side of Madison High for temporary classrooms," he suggested, addressing the school concerns. "And I've been in contact with several local landlords who are willing to offer reduced rent for displaced families." One by one, former critics became active participants in the recovery planning. They volunteered to help others, shared resources, and worked alongside James with newfound respect. As evening approached, James moved through the hall, checking on families settled in for the night. He paused at the supply station, where volunteers were preparing more aid packages. The sight of people working together, regardless of past differences, filled him with hope. A city official approached with updates about building inspections and insurance assessments. James added these details to his growing list of tasks, his dedication unwavering despite his exhaustion. The community was coming together, healing not just the physical damage but also the social divisions that had once seemed so important. Late into the night, James remained at his post in the relief center, supervising the preparation of aid packages for the next day. Around him, volunteers worked quietly, their shared purpose stronger than any previous disagreements. The crisis had revealed what truly mattered, not past judgments or criticisms, but the fundamental human need to help one another in times of hardship. Lisa moved swiftly through the makeshift medical clinic, her white coat swishing as she attended to patients affected by the fire. The gymnasium-turned-hospital buzzed with activity as nurses and medical staff worked alongside her, treating burns, smoke inhalation, and various injuries. "Dr. Harrison?" called out a nurse, gesturing to a man clutching his bandaged arm. Lisa recognized him immediately, Mr. Roberts, who had once led a petition against her father's adoption decision. His face was streaked with soot and his breathing was labored. "Let's take a look at that arm," Lisa said professionally, gently unwrapping the temporary bandage. Mr. Roberts winced, but remained still as she examined the second-degree burn. "I never thought," he started, then paused to catch his breath. "I never thought I'd be treated by one of James Harrison's daughters. We weren't kind to your family." Lisa cleaned the wound with practiced care. "That's in the past, Mr. Roberts. Right now you need medical attention, and that's what matters." Across the campus, Angela coordinated with volunteers at the shelter camps. She directed people to available cots while Janet and Bethany helped sort through donated clothes. Ellie, the youngest, had organized a corner where displaced children could color and play games, keeping their minds off the tragedy. "Mrs. Harrison," called a woman holding a toddler, "I can't thank you enough. Your family, you've shown us what community really means." Angela smiled warmly, helping the woman find diapers and baby supplies. "We're all in this together," she replied, watching as her daughters worked efficiently around the camp. Janet approached with an armful of blankets. "Mom, we've got more families coming in from the east side. Their apartments were damaged by water from the firefighting." "Set up Section C for them," Angela instructed. "Bethany's already preparing hot meals in the kitchen." Back at the clinic, Lisa treated patient after patient, her medical training merging with the compassion she'd learned from her adoptive parents. When Mrs. Peterson, another former critic, came in with her asthmatic son, Lisa's quick action and calm demeanor helped prevent a severe attack. "You've become an amazing doctor," Mrs. Peterson said softly, holding her sleeping son. "Your father must be so proud." As evening approached, Lisa finished treating her last patient. She sat down for the first time in hours, her muscles aching but her heart full. Through the window, she could see her family still at work in the relief camp, Angela organizing sleeping arrangements, Janet and Bethany distributing evening meals, and Ellie leading children in quiet games. The sight of her family working together to help others, even those who had once judged them harshly, filled her with profound gratitude. Despite her exhaustion, Lisa felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that they had truly made a difference in their community's darkest hour. The community hall buzzed with anxious energy as residents filled every available seat. James stood at the podium, his familiar presence bringing a sense of calm to the crowded room. Maps and architectural drawings lined the walls, showing plans for rebuilding the fire-damaged areas. "We've housed 67 families in temporary shelters," James began, his voice steady and reassuring. "Thanks to generous donations, we have enough supplies to sustain them for the next month while we implement our rebuilding strategy." Mr. Roberts, his arm still bandaged, stood up from his seat. "Mr. Harrison," he called out, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to say something." James nodded, and Mr. Roberts continued, "I was wrong about you. Many of us were. We questioned your character when you adopted those girls, but now we see the truth. Your whole family has shown us what real leadership and compassion look like." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson, clutching a folder of insurance papers, stood next. "My son might not be here if it wasn't for your daughter Lisa's quick thinking. Your family didn't hesitate to help us even though we weren't kind to you in the past." James adjusted his glasses, visibly moved by these testimonies. "Thank you, but this isn't about the past. This is about our future as a community." He gestured to the architectural plans. "We've secured funding to rebuild the school wing with improved safety features. The City Council has also approved emergency funding for affected homeowners. Mayor Johnson stepped forward with additional details about the reconstruction timeline. As James and other officials outlined the plans, hands raised throughout the audience with questions about resources and assistance. "We're establishing a permanent emergency response center," James explained, pointing to a detailed blueprint. "This will help us react more quickly to future crises." The meeting continued with various department heads presenting their specific roles in the recovery effort. Throughout it all, James maintained his calm demeanor, addressing each concern with patience and clarity. When discussion turned to the distribution of long-term aid, several residents shared stories of how the relief efforts had already helped their families. The atmosphere in the room shifted from anxiety to hope as people began to see a path forward. Mrs. Chen, whose restaurant had been damaged in the fire, spoke up. "Mr. Harrison's leadership has brought us together. We're stronger now than before the fire." As the meeting drew to a close, the mood in the community hall was markedly different from when it began. People clustered in groups, discussing ways they could help each other and contribute to the rebuilding efforts. James stood surrounded by residents offering their support and thanks. The community finally united behind his leadership. A few months had passed after the fire. The night was quiet when Mary responded to the burglary alarm at Johnson's corner store. Her police training had prepared her for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. As she approached the store's entrance, she noticed movement inside. Through the glass, she could make out two figures desperately stuffing items into bags. Following protocol, Mary called for backup and announced her presence. "Police, come out with your hands up," she commanded, her voice firm and clear. The burglars froze. One of them, a man she recognized from the fire relief center, turned toward her with panic in his eyes. "Please," he called out. "My family hasn't eaten in days. The aid isn't enough." Mary's heart ached with recognition, but she maintained her professional stance. "We can get you help, but you need to come out now." Suddenly, the second figure pulled out a gun. Everything happened in a blur. A flash, a loud crack, and Mary fell backward onto the cold pavement. The emergency response was immediate. Sirens wailed through the night as fellow officers and paramedics rushed to the scene. Within minutes, an ambulance was speeding toward County General Hospital, where Lisa worked her residency. James received the call at home. His hands trembled as he woke Angela, and they quickly gathered Janet, Bethany, and Ellie. The drive to the hospital was silent, heavy with fear and desperate prayers. In the emergency room, Lisa was already there, still in her scrubs from her shift. She paced the waiting room floor, torn between her role as a doctor and her position as a sister. "The bullet hit near her heart," she explained to her family, her medical training barely masking her terror. "They've taken her straight to surgery." Hours passed in the sterile hospital waiting room. Angela held Ellie, who couldn't stop crying. Bethany and Janet sat close together, clutching each other's hands. James stood by the window, his normally commanding presence diminished by helplessness. The surgical team worked tirelessly, but Mary's injuries were too severe. Despite multiple attempts to stabilize her, her heart couldn't withstand the trauma. At 3:47 a.m., the surgeon emerged from the operating room, his face grave. "I'm so sorry," he began, and Angela's sob broke the silence before he could finish. The news hit the family like a physical blow. Lisa collapsed into a chair, her medical knowledge making the finality all too clear. James held Angela as she wept, while the younger girls huddled together, their grief too profound for words. The hospital room where they said goodbye was quiet except for their muffled cries. Mary lay still, looking peaceful despite the violence that had taken her. Each family member took turns holding her hand, saying private farewells to the brave daughter and sister who had died trying to help others. The autumn leaves fell softly as James and Angela sat at their dining room table, surrounded by photographs of Mary. They carefully selected images that captured their daughter's spirit. Mary in her police cadet uniform, Mary playing basketball with her sisters, Mary volunteering at the fire relief center. Each picture told a story of a life dedicated to helping others. Lisa handled the arrangements with the funeral home, her medical training helping her maintain composure even as her heart ached. Janet, Bethany, and Ellie worked together to create a memorial video, their tears falling on keyboards as they assembled footage of happier times. The day of the funeral arrived with a gentle morning light. The church filled quickly with mourners, police officers in formal uniforms, community members from the fire relief efforts, and even those who had once criticized James's decision to adopt the sisters. The pews creaked under the weight of shared grief. Mary's police academy instructor stood at the podium first. Mary wasn't just a cadet, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was the embodiment of what we hope all officers will be: brave, compassionate, and dedicated to serving others. Angela spoke next, her hands trembling as she held her prepared words. Mary came into our lives like a bright light, she began. She taught us that family isn't about blood. It's about love and choice and standing together through everything. James stood beside his wife, supporting her as she struggled through her speech. When it was his turn, he spoke of Mary's determination, her infectious laugh, and her unwavering commitment to justice. She believed in second chances, he said, looking out at the faces of those who had once doubted them. She believed in the good in people, even when it wasn't easy to see. Lisa shared stories of late-night talks with her sister about their shared dedication to public service, one through medicine, the other through law enforcement. Janet, Bethany, and Ellie spoke together, their voices intertwining as they remembered their sister's protective nature and gentle teasing. Throughout the service, police officers stood at attention, their badges wrapped in black bands. Community members who had received Mary's help during the fire crisis placed white roses on her casket, each flower representing a life she had touched. The police department presented the family with Mary's badge, mounted in a wooden frame along with a Medal of Valor. Her fellow cadets performed a ceremonial last call, the radio silence after her number was called echoing through the church. As the service drew to a close, the family stood together at the front of the church. James held Angela close, while Lisa wrapped her arms around her younger sisters. Community members approached one by one, offering condolences and sharing brief memories of Mary's kindness and courage. The sight of so many people coming together, former critics standing alongside longtime supporters, police officers embracing community members, spoke to the impact Mary had made in her short life. Though their loss felt insurmountable, the family found a measure of comfort in the outpouring of love and support that surrounded them. James sat at the polished wooden table in the city council chambers, his fingers drumming against a thick stack of reports. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., but the discussion about the homelessness crisis showed no signs of winding down. "We need immediate action," he insisted, pushing forward a detailed proposal. "These families lost everything in the fire, and the temporary shelters are already at capacity." Councilwoman Martinez nodded in agreement. "The crime rates in affected areas have spiked. People are desperate." Over the next few days, James threw himself into the work. He visited each shelter personally, clipboard in hand, noting needed improvements. At the largest facility, housed in an old gymnasium, he found families cramped together on cots, their few belongings stored in boxes beneath their beds. "We need more privacy screens," he told the shelter manager, watching as children attempted to do homework on their laps, "and proper study areas for the kids." Working with the police department, James helped establish regular patrols around the shelters. He recognized many of the officers. They had attended Mary's funeral. Their commitment to protecting these vulnerable families seemed stronger now, touched by their fallen colleagues' dedication to service. At a meeting with local NGOs, James presented the city's needs clearly. "We're looking at 3 months minimum before the first wave of rebuilt housing is ready," he explained. "These families need support now." The response was encouraging. Several organizations pledged additional funding, while others offered expertise in trauma counseling and job placement services. James coordinated with federal agencies to expedite emergency assistance applications. In the community forums he organized, James faced both gratitude and frustration. "My children haven't had a proper home in weeks," one mother said, her voice breaking. "I understand," James responded, remembering his own daughter's transition from instability to security. "We're working to change that. Tomorrow, we're opening a new community center with proper facilities for families." On the night the center opened, James walked through its brightly lit halls. Families were settling into rooms with real beds and private bathrooms. In the common area, volunteers served hot meals while children played quietly with donated toys. Social workers sat at tables, helping adults fill out job applications and housing forms. The sight of a young girl reading peacefully in a corner, her younger sibling sleeping nearby, brought a lump to James's throat. As he headed to his car under the star-lit sky, he felt a cautious sense of hope growing in his heart. On a Sunday afternoon, the sisters gathered in their cozy living room, each holding something special that reminded them of Mary. Lisa clutched Mary's Police Academy acceptance letter, while Janet and Bethany held photographs of their sister at various community events. Ellie kept Mary's favorite coffee mug close to her chest, running her fingers over the chipped rim. "We need to do something," Lisa said softly, "something that keeps Mary's spirit alive." The idea of a scholarship fund came naturally to Lisa. She spent evenings after her hospital shifts working on the paperwork, setting up meetings with school administrators and local businesses for funding. "The Mary Thompson Memorial Scholarship," she explained to the school board, "will help students who want to serve their community, just like Mary did." Janet and Bethany transformed their grief into art. Their school's art teacher offered them space in the main hallway for their exhibit. Janet painted powerful scenes of first responders in action, while Bethany created mixed media pieces incorporating newspaper clippings about community service. "Mary always said art should tell important stories," Janet explained to curious classmates who stopped to watch them work. Ellie, the youngest, found her voice through writing. Her blog, titled Letters to Mary, started as personal entries about missing her sister. Soon, other people who had lost loved ones began leaving comments and sharing their own stories. "Sometimes I write about the little things," Ellie told a classmate who'd recently lost her grandmother. "Like how Mary used to burn toast every morning, but ate it anyway because she hated wasting food." The projects gained momentum. Local businesses matched Lisa's initial scholarship fund contribution. The art exhibit expanded to include works from other students inspired by Mary's story. Ellie's blog reached readers across the country, creating a supportive online community. For the showcase event, the family transformed their backyard into an intimate gathering space. Lisa displayed information about the scholarship recipients, 3 promising students planning careers in law enforcement and emergency services. Janet and Bethany's artwork lined the fence, creating an outdoor gallery. Ellie set up a small reading corner where she shared selected blog posts. Community members moved through the space, many wiping away tears as they took in the sisters' tributes. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mary's favorite teacher from elementary school, hugged each sister. "Your sister would be so proud," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The school principal stood near Janet and Bethany's artwork, studying a particularly moving piece showing hands joined in a circle of support. "This captures exactly what our community needs," he said, nodding appreciatively. A young girl approached Ellie's reading corner, clutching a notebook. "Your blog helped me after my brother passed," she said quietly. "Can you teach me how to start my own?" As the evening progressed, the backyard filled with stories, tears, and even occasional laughter as people shared memories of Mary and expressed amazement at how her sisters had transformed their pain into purpose. Bethany stood in the empty storefront, her footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floors. The space, though modest, held so much potential. She remembered how Mary had always talked about creating places where people could come together, feel safe, and build connections. "This spot has good bones," James said, running his hand along a weathered counter. "Just needs some love." Angela was already making notes on her tablet. "We'll need to update the electrical, but the kitchen equipment is surprisingly well maintained." Over the next few weeks, Bethany threw herself into transforming the space. She painted the walls in warm, welcoming colors and installed track lighting to highlight the local artwork she planned to display. The cafe's name, Mary's Place, was hand-painted above the entrance in flowing script. "The hiring process is the trickiest part," Bethany confided to her family during dinner. "I want to give opportunities to kids who really need them, just like Mary would have done." She interviewed dozens of local teenagers, particularly focusing on those from struggling families. Each new hire received training not just in food service, but also in financial literacy and customer service skills. The cafe's opening day arrived with a line stretching down the block. Local artists had contributed pieces for the walls, and the display created a gallery-like atmosphere. The menu featured simple but hearty fare, with each item named after someone special in the community. The Mary Special, a grilled cheese sandwich with 3 kinds of cheese and homemade tomato soup, quickly became the most popular item. Bethany had chosen it because it was her sister's favorite comfort food during late-night study sessions. James helped with the bookkeeping while Angela coordinated with local suppliers to ensure they got the freshest ingredients at fair prices. The cafe soon became known for more than just its food. Weekly poetry readings, art workshops, and community meetings filled the evening schedule. 3 months after opening, Bethany organized a special event in Mary's honor. The cafe stayed open late, with all proceeds going to a scholarship fund for aspiring police officers. Photos of Mary in her cadet uniform decorated the walls, alongside artwork created by local children depicting their heroes in uniform. On this particular evening, Bethany moved efficiently between tables, refilling coffee cups and chatting with regulars. A group of teenagers, her employees, worked confidently behind the counter, calling out orders and helping customers. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, along with the rich aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods. She paused briefly at the counter, watching as one of her young employees patiently explained the menu to an elderly customer. The girl's confident smile reminded Bethany of Mary's own way with people, kind, patient, and genuinely interested in helping others. The cafe had become exactly what she'd hoped for, not just a business, but a living tribute to Mary's spirit of community service and care for others. Each day brought new faces and new stories, weaving together the fabric of their neighborhood in ways that would have made Mary proud. James gathered his family in their cozy living room one evening, the warm glow of table lamps casting gentle shadows on their faces. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice soft but determined. "We need time. Time to heal. Time to be together. I'm taking a sabbatical from both the school and city council." Angela reached over and squeezed his hand while their daughters looked up with interest. "I want us to travel," he continued, "to all those places Mary talked about visiting someday." Ellie's eyes brightened. "Like the Grand Canyon? Mary always said she wanted to watch the sunset there." "Exactly," James nodded, pulling out a well-worn travel journal. "I found this in Mary's room. It's filled with places she hoped to see." The family spent the next few weeks planning their journey. Lisa took time off from her medical residency, while Bethany arranged for her cafe to be managed by her trusted staff. Janet and Ellie worked together, creating detailed itineraries based on Mary's journal entries. Their first stop was Yellowstone National Park. As they watched Old Faithful erupt against the blue sky, Angela pulled out Mary's journal and read her words about wanting to see the famous geyser. She wrote that it reminded her of how nature keeps its promises, Angela said, her voice catching slightly. In Seattle, they visited the Space Needle, something Mary had circled multiple times in her travel guides. The family took turns writing postcards at each destination, addressing them to Mary and keeping them in a special box. Bethany wrote about the fresh fish markets, knowing how her sister had loved trying new foods. Their days fell into a rhythm of exploration and remembrance. In Chicago, they attended a blues festival in Grant Park, recalling how Mary used to play air guitar to B.B. King songs. Janet sketched the city skyline, adding it to their growing collection of travel memories. At Mount Rushmore, Lisa shared a story about Mary's fascination with presidential history, how she'd memorized facts about each president for her civics class. The family spent hours at the monument, taking photos and writing in their journals. In New Orleans, they explored the French Quarter, sampling beignets and listening to street musicians. Ellie recorded the jazz music on her phone, remembering how Mary would dance around their kitchen to Louis Armstrong tunes. Each evening, they gathered to share their thoughts and memories. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, but always they felt Mary's presence in their midst. The travel helped them process their grief differently. Seeing new places through what would have been her eyes brought both sadness and healing. As they approached their final destination, the Grand Canyon, James noticed how their shared experiences had brought them closer. The initial raw pain of their loss had gradually transformed into a deeper appreciation for each other and the moments they shared. They arrived at the canyon's south rim just before sunset. The vast expanse of red rock stretched before them, painted in increasingly dramatic colors as the sun began its descent. The family stood together at the railing, arms linked, watching nature's display in reverent silence. On the final day of the sabbatical, the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as the family gathered on the secluded beach. Gentle waves lapped at the shore, providing a soothing rhythm. Each member of the family held an envelope containing their letter to Mary, papers carefully protected from the salty breeze. James looked at his family, arranged in a small semicircle on their beach blankets. "I think it's time," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the waves. Angela went first, unfolding her letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Mary," she began, her voice growing stronger as she read. "Your smile lit up every room you entered. I miss hearing your boots by the door and your cheerful 'I'm home' every evening." She paused, dabbing at her eyes. "I promise to keep your spirit of kindness alive, to help others the way you always did." Lisa followed, her medical ID badge still clipped to her shirt. Her letter spoke of shared secrets and sister moments, of late-night talks about their dreams and aspirations. "You pushed me to be better, to work harder," she read. "Every time I help someone at the hospital, I think of your dedication to serving others." Janet's letter was filled with small memories, shopping trips, shared music playlists, and inside jokes that made the family smile through their tears. Bethany wrote about how the cafe had become a living tribute to Mary's memory, serving as a gathering place for the community, just as Mary had always brought people together. Ellie, the youngest, had filled pages with colorful drawings alongside her words. "I decorated this letter with your favorite flowers," she explained, showing the family the carefully drawn daisies bordering her pages. Her letter spoke of missing her big sister's advice and protection, but also of finding strength in carrying on Mary's legacy of bravery. James went last, his weathered hands holding his letter carefully. He read about proud father moments, about watching Mary grow from a hesitant foster child into a confident young woman determined to make a difference. His voice cracked as he described the day she announced her decision to join the police academy, her eyes shining with purpose. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, they stood together at the water's edge. James produced 6 paper boats he had folded earlier, and they carefully placed their letters inside. One by one, they waded ankle-deep into the warm water and released their boats into the gentle current. The family stood silently, watching the small fleet drift outward, carrying their words of love and remembrance. The setting sun caught the white paper, making the boats glow like tiny beacons on the water. Angela leaned against James, their other daughters gathering close, as they watched their messages to Mary merge with the vast ocean before them. The family had decided to have family nights often. To start off with this, the living room buzzed with energy as the family settled in for their first official family night. James and Angela had rearranged the furniture to create a cozy circle, with plenty of cushions scattered around for comfort. The coffee table held bowls of popcorn and favorite snacks, while a whiteboard propped nearby displayed a neat schedule of upcoming weeks. "All right, who's going first?" Angela asked, holding up a jar filled with folded paper slips containing their names. "I think Lisa should start," Ellie suggested, curled up in her favorite armchair, "since she'll be the busiest with her hospital schedule." Lisa smiled, adjusting her glasses. "I already have some ideas. Maybe we could do a medical trivia night. With prizes?" "As long as it's not too gross," Janet laughed, reaching for the popcorn. Bethany pulled out her planner, already jotting down notes. "I can bring treats from the cafe for whoever wins." James watched his family with warm eyes as they discussed their plans. Each daughter had different interests they wanted to share. Janet's love for art could lead to painting nights, while Bethany's culinary skills promised delicious cooking sessions. Ellie's enthusiasm for board games would surely feature in her weeks. "We should have some ground rules," Angela suggested, picking up a marker. "Like no phones during family night?" "And everyone has to participate," James added, even if it's not their favorite activity. The family spent the next hour planning their schedule, marking important dates and discussing potential activities. They decided to keep Mary's memory alive by incorporating some of her favorite games and movies into their rotation. "Remember how she always insisted on being the banker in Monopoly?" Lisa reminisced, causing everyone to chuckle. "And then somehow always ended up winning," Bethany added with a fond smile. The conversation flowed naturally from there, touching on their days and recent experiences. Janet shared her excitement about an upcoming art exhibition, while Ellie talked about her blog's growing readership. The atmosphere was relaxed and supportive, creating a safe space for sharing both triumphs and concerns. As the evening progressed, they decided to end their first family night with an impromptu pizza-making session. The kitchen filled with laughter as they worked together, flour dusting their clothes and toppings being playfully tossed across the counter. "No pineapple on my half?" Ellie protested as Lisa reached for the controversial topping. "You don't know what you're missing," Lisa teased, deliberately sprinkling extra pieces near Ellie's section. James and Angela exchanged glances, their hearts full as they watched their daughters joke and collaborate. The weekly tradition was already proving to be exactly what they needed, a dedicated time to strengthen their bonds and maintain their connection through life's ups and downs. The aroma of baking pizza filled the house as they gathered back in the living room, plates balanced on their laps. The simple act of sharing a meal together, surrounded by love and laughter, reinforced their commitment to maintaining this special weekly tradition. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as hundreds of proud families filled the seats. James, Angela, Janet, Bethany, and Ellie sat in the front row, their hearts swelling with pride as they waited for Lisa's name to be called. "Dr. Lisa Montgomery, graduating summa cum laude," the dean announced, his voice carrying across the packed hall. Lisa walked across the stage with confident steps, her graduation gown flowing behind her. As she accepted her diploma, her family erupted in cheers, with Ellie letting out an enthusiastic whistle that made several people turn and smile. Minutes later, Lisa approached the podium for her valedictory speech. She adjusted the microphone, her hand steady despite her racing heart. Her gaze found her family in the front row, drawing strength from their presence. "When I think about the journey that brought me here today," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I think about the power of family, both given and chosen. My parents, James and Angela, took a chance on 5 sisters who needed a home. They showed us what unconditional love truly means." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My sister Mary taught me about courage and service before her life was cut tragically short. She wanted to protect and serve our community as a police officer. Her dream inspires my own path in emergency medicine, where I hope to save lives and make a difference, just as she would have done." In the audience, Angela wiped tears from her eyes as James held her hand tightly. Janet and Bethany leaned against each other, while Ellie sat straight and proud, recording the speech on her phone. "To my sisters here today," Lisa continued, her voice warming with emotion, "thank you for your endless support and love. Together, we've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, commitment, and standing by each other through both joy and sorrow." After the ceremony, the family gathered at Lisa's favorite restaurant. The table was filled with her favorite dishes as they celebrated her achievement. Lisa shared her plans for her upcoming residency at the local hospital's emergency department. "I've already been talking with the hospital administration," she explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "They're interested in my proposal for a community outreach program, providing basic medical training to underserved neighborhoods. It's something Mary would have loved." "She would be so proud of you," Angela said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze Lisa's hand. James raised his glass in a toast. "To Lisa, and to Mary's lasting influence on all of us." The family then moved outside to the restaurant's garden for photos. Lisa stood in her cap and gown, diploma in hand, surrounded by her loving family. The photographer captured multiple shots, serious poses, silly faces, and spontaneous moments of laughter and hugs. As they gathered close for one final photo, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the scene. Lisa held her diploma close to her heart, her family's arms wrapped around her in a tight embrace, their faces reflecting both joy and the bittersweet awareness of Mary's absence in this milestone moment. If you enjoyed the story of James, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.